Margaret Chen carefully placed the last box on her kitchen counter and looked around her new home. At 62 years old, she was starting over. The house was smaller than the one she'd shared with her husband for 35 years, but it felt right. After his passing 6 months ago, the old place had just felt too empty, too full of memories. This little ranch-style home in Willow Creek was closer to her daughter and those 2 precious grandchildren who made everything worthwhile. She spent that first week unpacking slowly, taking her time to make the place feel like home. Her neighbors seemed friendly enough. The couple next door waved every morning. The family across the street had dropped off cookies on her second day. Margaret liked the quiet streets and the neat rows of houses. Everything looked peaceful and well-maintained. What none of these neighbors knew, what nobody could tell just by looking at her small frame and gentle smile, was that Margaret had spent 40 years mastering karate. She held a 5th-degree black belt in Shotokan karate. For 3 decades, she'd run her own training studio, teaching everyone from nervous kids to competitive fighters. She'd even coached athletes who went on to win national championships. But that was her old life. Here in Willow Creek, she was just Margaret, the quiet widow who liked gardening and spending time with her grandkids. Her mornings fell into a comfortable routine. She'd wake up early, tend to the small flower bed in her front yard, and then sit on her porch with coffee and a book. The neighborhood seemed almost perfect. Almost. That's when she met Diane Patterson. Diane was the HOA president, and she took her job very seriously. Maybe too seriously. She was in her late 40s, always dressed like she was heading to an important business meeting, and she drove a black luxury SUV that gleamed in the sunlight. People in the neighborhood didn't just respect Diane, they feared her. Margaret found this out 3 weeks after moving in. She was watering her flowers when Diane's SUV pulled up to the curb. Diane stepped out carrying a clipboard and walked straight up to Margaret's front yard like she owned it. "Mrs. Chen, I presume." Diane didn't smile. She just started looking around the yard, making notes on her clipboard. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something?" Margaret kept her voice friendly. "I'm Diane Patterson, HOA president. I'm here about several violations on your property." Diane pointed at the small garden gnome peeking out from behind Margaret's roses. "That decoration violates Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our community guidelines. Only approved garden ornaments are permitted." Margaret glanced at the cheerful little gnome. She'd bought it because it reminded her of one her husband had loved. "Oh, I didn't realize I can move it inside. You'll need to remove it entirely from outdoor display." Diane made another note. She then pointed at Margaret's welcome mat. "That mat is also non-compliant. The color scheme doesn't match approved neutral tones." Margaret looked down at her mat. It was burgundy with a simple, "Welcome," written on it. Nothing fancy or bright. "I understand," Margaret said quietly. "I'll take care of it." Diane studied her for a moment and something flickered in her eyes. Maybe she expected an argument. Maybe she was testing Margaret. Whatever it was, Margaret's calm acceptance seemed to register as weakness. "See that you do." First violations. "Come with a warning, but I'll be monitoring your property closely." Diane walked back to her SUV and drove off. The neighbor from next door, an older man named Bill, came over shaking his head. "Don't take it personally. That's just how Diane is. She's got rules for everything, and she loves catching people breaking them." "Has she always been like this?" Margaret asked. Bill laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "As long as I've lived here, about 8 years now. She fined us $200 once because our mailbox was 3 inches taller than regulation height." 3 inches. Most folks just learn to do exactly what she says and stay off her radar. Margaret thanked him for the information and went back inside. She moved the gnome to her living room windowsill and bought a beige welcome mat the next day. It seemed like a small thing, not worth making a fuss over, but that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Margaret noticed Diane driving slowly past her house several times a day. She'd see that black SUV crawling by, Diane's head turning to inspect every inch of Margaret's property. Then the violation notices started arriving. Her porch light was too bright. $50 fine. Her bird feeder was attracting too many birds, which apparently counted as nuisance wildlife. $75 fine. One morning, Margaret found a key, notice stating that her car had been parked in her own driveway, past the overnight parking cutoff by 30 minutes. $100 fine. Margaret paid every single fine without complaint. She adjusted her porch light. She took down the bird feeder. She set an alarm to make sure her car was in the garage by the exact time required. Her daughter asked why she didn't fight back. "Mom, this is harassment. You don't have to put up with this." But Margaret just smiled. "It's fine, sweetheart. I'm not here to make waves. I'm here for peace." What Margaret didn't say was that in her 40 years of martial arts training, she'd learned something more important than how to fight. She'd learned patience. She'd learned that the loudest, most aggressive person in the room is often the weakest. She'd learned that real strength doesn't need to announce itself. So she kept her head down, paid the fines, and went about her quiet life. The other neighbors watched and whispered. They felt sorry for her, but nobody stepped in to help. They'd all learned the hard way that crossing Diane Patterson only made things worse. And Diane, seeing Margaret's gentle compliance, only grew bolder. She'd found her perfect target. 3 months had passed since Margaret moved to Willow Creek, and the violation notices kept coming like clockwork. Every week, there was something new. Her garbage can was placed 6 inches too far from the curb. Her mailbox had a small scratch that needed immediate repair. The pine tree in her front yard was dropping needles on the sidewalk faster than she could sweep them. Margaret had paid over $800 in fines. $800 for things most people wouldn't even notice. But she never complained. She'd simply smile, write the check, and fix whatever Diane had found wrong this time. The other neighbors started talking about it. At the community mailboxes, in hushed conversations at the grocery store parking lot, people would shake their heads and say things like, "Poor Margaret," or "Diane's really got it out for her." But talking was all they did. Nobody wanted to be next on Diane's list. Things got stranger when Diane started showing up unannounced. Margaret would be reading on her porch, and suddenly Diane would be there, walking around the yard with her camera, snapping pictures of anything she could call a violation. She'd peer through windows, check the measurements of Margaret's fence, even count the number of flowers in each garden bed to make sure they matched HOA regulations that Margaret didn't even know existed. "Just documenting," Diane would say with that cold smile when Margaret would politely ask what she was doing. "It's my duty as HOA president to ensure compliance." The certified letters started arriving too, thick envelopes with legal-sounding language about Margaret's continued pattern of violations and disregard for community standards. They threatened legal action, possible liens on her property, even suggested she might be asked to leave the community entirely. Margaret's daughter was furious. "Mom, you need to fight this. Get a lawyer. This is insane." But Margaret would just pat her daughter's hand. "I'm handling it, honey. Don't worry about me." What her daughter didn't see was what Margaret did in the early mornings, alone in her garage. While the neighborhood slept, Margaret would go through her training routines, punches, kicks, forms that she'd practiced 10,000 times over the years. The movements were as natural to her as breathing. She'd finish with meditation, centering herself, reminding herself why she didn't react to Diane's provocations. Violence wasn't the answer. It never was. Her sensei had taught her that decades ago. The strongest warrior is the one who never has to fight. But Diane didn't understand restraint. She saw it as weakness. The monthly HOA meetings became Margaret's least favorite part of living in Willow Creek. Diane would stand at the front of the community center, holding court like a judge, and she always made time to single out Margaret. "As you can see from this month's violation report," Diane would announce, holding up papers for everyone to see. "Mrs. Chen continues to be our most problematic resident. 17 violations in the past 3 months. 17. Margaret would sit there, hands folded in her lap, face calm. Around her, neighbors would stare at their shoes, embarrassed for her but too scared to speak up. "I think we need to discuss whether residents who show such blatant disrespect for our community rules should be allowed to remain here," Diane would continue, looking directly at Margaret. It was humiliating. It was meant to be humiliating. But Margaret never gave Diane the satisfaction of seeing her upset. She'd sit through the entire meeting with that same peaceful expression, nod when spoken to, and leave quietly when it was over. Bill, her neighbor, caught up with her after one particularly brutal meeting. "Margaret, why do you let her do this to you? You're the kindest person in this neighborhood. It's not right." "She needs to feel powerful," Margaret said simply. "I'm not going to take that away from her." Bill looked confused. "But she's making your life miserable," Margaret smiled. "No, she's making herself miserable. I'm doing just fine, and she was mostly. She had her grandchildren visiting often. She had her morning coffee and her books. She had her training in the garage where nobody could see. The fines were annoying and the harassment was tiresome, but Margaret had survived much harder things in life. This was just noise. Then came the Saturday that changed everything. It was a beautiful morning in early spring. Margaret was in her backyard doing Tai Chi, the slow flowing movements that helped her cool down after her more intense training. The grass was still wet with dew and birds were singing in the trees. It was peaceful, until Diane came marching through her back gate without knocking, without permission, without any warning at all. "What is this?" Diane demanded, pointing at Margaret like she'd caught her committing a crime. Margaret slowly finished her movement before turning to face her. "Good morning, Diane. I'm just doing some morning exercises. This bizarre activity is disturbing the neighbors. I've had complaints." Diane was already taking pictures with her phone. Margaret doubted that was true. Her backyard was private, surrounded by a tall fence. But she stayed calm. "I'm sorry if I've bothered anyone. I'll try to be quieter. And your garage." Diane pointed toward it. "I have reason to believe you've converted it into an unauthorized fitness facility. That requires HOA approval and proper permits." Margaret almost laughed at that. Her garage held some basic training equipment and lots of memories, but it was hardly a fitness facility. "It's just my personal space, Diane. I'm not running a business." Diane stepped closer, invading Margaret's personal space in that way bullies do when they want to intimidate someone. Her finger came up, jabbing toward Margaret's face but not quite touching her. "I am sick and tired of your attitude," Diane hissed, her voice low and mean. "You think you can just ignore our rules? You think you're special? I will have you evicted from this community. I will make sure you lose this house. Do you understand me?" Margaret stood perfectly still. Her breathing was calm. Her stance was balanced. She looked at Diane with eyes that showed no fear, no anger, just a deep, quiet strength that made Diane pause for just a second. "I understand you're upset," Margaret said softly. "I'll go inside now." She turned and walked toward her back door, leaving Diane standing there, still shouting threats at her back. 3 neighbors had seen the whole thing from their windows. They'd talk about it later, about how Margaret had stayed so calm while Diane had completely lost control. But none of them would say anything to Diane, not yet. That Saturday was just a preview of what was coming. July came with a heat wave that made everything shimmer. The kind of heat where the asphalt felt soft under your shoes and everyone moved a little slower. Margaret's grandchildren were visiting for the week, and they'd been begging to go to the community pool since they arrived. 7-year-old Kevin and 9-year-old Lisa were good kids. Polite, well-behaved, the kind of children who said please and thank you without being reminded. Margaret had packed their pool bag that morning with sunscreen, towels, and snacks, excited to spend the afternoon watching them play. The community pool was beautiful, one of those things that made HOA fees almost worth it. Crystal blue water, plenty of lounge chairs, and on a Wednesday afternoon it was nearly empty. Perfect. Kevin and Lisa jumped in the shallow end right away, squealing with delight at the cold water. Margaret settled into a chair nearby, close enough to watch them but far enough to give them space to play. She'd brought a book but mostly just enjoyed watching them splash and laugh. This was what mattered. Not Diane, not violations, not any of it. Just these moments with family. 20 minutes later, Diane's black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Margaret felt her stomach tighten, but she stayed calm. The pool was for everyone. Diane had as much right to be here as anyone else. Maybe she wouldn't even notice them, but of course she did. Diane walked through the gate with her teenage son trailing behind her, carrying a designer pool bag that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery bill. She immediately started looking around and her eyes landed on Margaret and the kids. "This is ridiculous," Diane announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying across the pool deck. This pool is completely overcrowded. There were 8 people total at the pool, counting Margaret, Diane, and their kids. The pool could easily hold 50. Margaret pretended not to hear, keeping her attention on Kevin and Lisa. They were playing Marco Polo, their happy voices echoing off the water. Diane set up her things at the far end, but she kept talking loudly about how some people didn't know proper pool etiquette and how certain residents let their children run wild. Her son looked embarrassed and put in his earbuds. Everything was fine until Kevin, swimming enthusiastically during a game, accidentally splashed water toward Diane's area. A few drops landed near her pool bag, maybe on it. It was hard to tell. Diane exploded. She shot up from her chair and marched over to where Kevin was treading water, his little face confused about why this angry woman was suddenly standing over him. "You need to control yourself," Diane shouted down at him. "That bag costs more than your grandmother probably makes in a month. Do you have any idea how to behave in public?" Kevin's lips started trembling. Lisa swam over and grabbed her little brother's hand. Margaret was already standing, already moving toward them. Her voice was calm but firm. "Diane, he's 7 years old. It was an accident. Please talk to me if there's a problem." "The problem," Diane whirled on her, "is that you bring these undisciplined children here and let them destroy other people's property. The problem is that you have no business being a member of this pool in the first place." "The water barely touched your bag," Margaret said quietly, "and even if it did, it's a pool. Things get wet. Let me apologize and we can all move on." She started gathering the kids' things. This wasn't worth it. They'd leave, go get ice cream instead, make it a fun afternoon anyway. "Oh no," Diane said, stepping closer. "You don't get to just leave. You need to hear this. You and your family are not welcome here. You've been nothing but a problem since the day you moved in, and now you're raising the next generation to be just as disrespectful." Other people at the pool were watching now, a couple at the other end, a teenage girl on a lounge chair. Everyone could hear everything. Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm taking the children and leaving. I'm sorry you're upset." She reached for Kevin's hand to help him out of the pool. That's when Diane made her big mistake. She grabbed Margaret's arm, hard. Her fingernails dug into Margaret's skin, trying to pull her back, trying to physically stop her from leaving. "You're not going anywhere until I'm done talking," Diane hissed. For just a second, everything went quiet. Even the water seemed to stop moving. Margaret's whole body changed, though if you weren't trained, you might not notice. Her stance shifted almost imperceptibly. Her center of gravity dropped. Her arm, which had seemed soft under Diane's grip, suddenly became like steel. She moved her wrist in a way that looked simple, almost gentle. A small rotation, barely any force at all, but it was 40 years of training condensed into one precise motion. Diane's grip broke instantly. Her own momentum, combined with the sudden release, sent her stumbling backward. Her foot caught on the leg of a pool chair and she crashed down onto it, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete. To everyone watching, it looked like Diane had just lost her balance. 1 second she was grabbing Margaret, the next she was sitting awkwardly on a chair, looking shocked. But Diane had felt something different. In that brief moment, she'd felt completely controlled by someone much stronger than she'd ever imagined. She'd felt powerless. Margaret knelt down to the kids' level, keeping her body between them and Diane. "Are you two okay?" she asked softly. They nodded, wide-eyed. "Good. Let's get dried off and go get some ice cream. Sound good?" They nodded again, and Margaret helped them out of the pool, wrapped them in towels, and gathered their things. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. Diane sat on that pool chair, her face bright red, unable to speak. The couple at the other end had their phones out. They'd recorded the whole thing. The teenage girl was already texting someone. By tonight, half the neighborhood would know what happened. Margaret walked past Diane with the kids, heading toward the exit. As she passed, she said quietly, just loud enough for Diane to hear, "You grabbed me first. Everyone saw it." I just pulled away. In the parking lot, Kevin asked, "Grandma, why was that lady so mean?" "Some people carry a lot of anger inside," Margaret said, buckling them into her car. "It's sad, really, but it's not about you. It's never about you." "You weren't scared at all," Lisa observed. Margaret smiled. "I've dealt with scarier things than angry people, sweetheart." They went for ice cream. The kids forgot about the pool incident within an hour, too busy arguing over whether chocolate or vanilla was better. But Diane wouldn't forget. And neither would the neighbors who'd witnessed everything. The video would be shared. The whispers would start. And for the first time since Margaret moved to Willow Creek, people would start asking questions about who this quiet woman really was. The next morning, Margaret found 3 violation notices in her mailbox, all dated before the pool incident. Diane was still trying, but something had shifted. Margaret held the notices and smiled. Let her try. The day after the pool incident, Diane filed an official complaint with the HOA board. She called it an emergency and demanded an immediate meeting. According to her written statement, Margaret had physically assaulted her at the community pool and should be removed from the neighborhood immediately. The board consisted of 3 other members besides Diane. Robert was a retired teacher who'd lived in Willow Creek for 15 years. Patricia owned a small accounting firm and tried to stay neutral on everything. And there was young Danny, barely 30, who'd only joined the board because nobody else wanted to. They were all tired of Diane. Exhausted, really. But she was intimidating, and fighting her seemed like more trouble than it was worth. So they usually just went along with whatever she wanted, but this time felt different. We need to investigate properly, Robert said carefully during the emergency meeting. This is a serious accusation. There's nothing to investigate, Diane snapped. I'm the victim here. She attacked me in front of witnesses. Then we should talk to those witnesses, Patricia suggested. Diane's face went red. Are you questioning my credibility? I'm the HOA president. Nobody's questioning anything, Danny said quickly, trying to keep the peace. We just need to follow procedure. Talk to everyone who was there, get statements, review what happened. Diane didn't like that answer, but she couldn't argue with it, not without looking unreasonable. Over the next week, the board members did something they rarely did. They actually investigated. Robert talked to the couple who'd been at the pool. Patricia interviewed the teenage girl. Danny reviewed the security footage from the pool entrance, which showed people arriving and leaving, but not the incident itself. What they found surprised them. Every single witness said the same thing. Diane had grabbed Margaret first. Margaret had pulled away. Diane had lost her balance and fallen into a chair. That was it. The couple even showed Robert the video they'd taken on their phone. It was shaky and shot from far away, but it clearly showed Diane grabbing Margaret's arm and Margaret simply pulling back. She's been harassing that poor woman for months, the wife told Robert. We've all seen it. Someone needed to say something. That opened the floodgates. Once people realized the board was actually listening, they started coming forward. Bill from next door showed up with a folder full of notes he'd been keeping. Dates, times, violations that seemed ridiculous. He'd documented everything he'd witnessed. Mrs. Rodriguez brought copies of her own violation notices from years ago, showing a pattern of Diane targeting specific people until they either did exactly what she wanted or moved away. Tom, the young father, admitted he'd been scared to say anything but couldn't stay quiet anymore. She's a bully. Plain and simple. And Margaret's the nicest person in this neighborhood. It's not right. The board members looked at each other. They'd all known deep down that Diane abused her power. But seeing it all laid out like this, hearing person after person confirm the same pattern, it was impossible to ignore anymore. Robert started digging into the HOA finances. He was good with numbers, always had been, and something hadn't felt right for a while. When he requested to see the detailed accounting of all violation fines collected over the past 2 years, Diane tried to block him. Those records are confidential, she insisted. I'm on the board, Robert replied calmly. I have a right to see them. What he found made his stomach turn. Thousands of dollars in fines that had been collected but never properly deposited into the HOA account, money that had essentially disappeared. And Diane had been paying herself an administrative salary that was never approved by the board or disclosed to the community. Patricia ran a business. She knew fraud when she saw it. This is serious, Diane. Really serious. Diane tried to explain it away, tried to say there were misunderstandings, tried to blame the bookkeeper. But the numbers didn't lie. Meanwhile, Danny had done something else. Something that would change everything. He'd Googled Margaret's name. It started as simple curiosity. Who was this quiet woman who'd managed to stay so calm while being harassed for months? He typed Margaret Chen martial arts into the search bar, not really expecting to find anything. What came up made his jaw drop. Newspaper articles from the 1980s and 90s. Photos of a younger Margaret holding trophies, wearing a black belt, standing on podiums. Headlines about championship victories. Features about her dojo and the Olympic hopefuls she'd trained. She wasn't just someone who'd taken a few karate classes. She was a legend in the martial arts community. Danny showed the articles to Robert and Patricia. They couldn't believe it. She could have seriously hurt Diane at any time, Patricia said, scrolling through the articles on Danny's phone. But she never did. She just took all that abuse and stayed calm. That's what real strength looks like, Robert said quietly. The board called for a special vote, one that didn't include Diane. It was time for her to go, but Diane wasn't done yet. She'd heard the whispers, sensed that something was changing. She decided to take one last shot at Margaret, one final attempt to assert her dominance. She showed up at Margaret's house late on a Thursday afternoon with two of her friends. Women who were loyal to Diane, who believed her version of every story, who thought Margaret had gotten away with assault and needed to be put in her place. Margaret answered the door in her white GI, the traditional karate uniform. She'd just finished her afternoon training session. Sweat still dampened her hairline. Diane stopped cold on the doorstep. The white uniform, the black belt tied perfectly at Margaret's waist. It was the first time she'd seen it. "Can I help you?" Margaret asked politely. "We need to talk about your behavior," Diane started, but her voice lacked its usual force. "Would you like to come in?" Margaret stepped back, opening the door wider. The three women entered hesitantly. Margaret's living room was neat and simple, but one wall was covered with framed photographs and medals. Championship trophies lined a shelf, pictures of Margaret in her prime, mid-kick, mid-punch, fierce and powerful, photos with famous martial artists, certificates from international competitions, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Diane stood frozen, staring at the wall. Her friends had gone quiet too. "I was going to make tea," Margaret said calmly. "Would you like some?" Nobody answered. They were too busy looking at the evidence of who Margaret really was. Not a weak target to be pushed around. Not someone helpless. A woman who'd spent 40 years mastering the art of combat but chose every single day not to use it. Margaret walked into her kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. When she came back, Diane and her friends were already heading toward the door. "We should go," Diane muttered. "The tea will only take a minute," Margaret offered. But they were already leaving, walking quickly to Diane's SUV, not looking back. Through her window, Margaret watched them drive away. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat down, and picked up her book. The next morning, she received a notice in the mail. The HOA board had scheduled a special meeting. All residents were encouraged to attend. The subject line read, "Leadership Review and Community Discussion." Margaret smiled and marked it on her calendar. Things were finally about to change. The community center was packed on the night of the special meeting. Margaret had never seen this many residents show up before. Usually these meetings drew maybe 20 people, mostly the same faces every time. Tonight there had to be at least 100. People were buzzing with conversation, speculation about what was happening. The word had spread quickly. Diane was being investigated. Money was missing. The pool incident had finally pushed things too far. Margaret sat in her usual spot in the back row. She didn't want attention. She'd never wanted attention. She just wanted to live quietly in her little house and be close to her grandchildren. Robert called the meeting to order, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," he began, looking tired but determined. "We've called this meeting because the board has discovered some serious issues with how our HOA has been managed. We owe this community transparency and honesty." He laid it all out. The missing funds, over $15,000 that Diane had collected in fines but never properly deposited. The unauthorized salary she'd been paying herself. The pattern of harassment and excessive violations targeting specific residents, especially Margaret. Diane sat in the front row, her face like stone. She'd tried to stop this meeting, tried to claim it was invalid, but she'd been outvoted 3-1. "We've reviewed months of documentation," Patricia added. "Violation notices, fines, complaints. What we found was a clear pattern of abuse of power. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories. Bill talked about the mailbox incident, how he'd been fined $200 for something that measured 3 inches too tall. Mrs. Rodriguez described how Diane had targeted her family for years until they'd learned to just obey every rule without question, living in constant fear. Tom spoke about watching Margaret get harassed for months and being too scared to say anything. "I'm ashamed of that," he admitted. "We all saw what was happening and we stayed silent because we didn't want to be next." The room murmured in agreement. A lot of people felt that same shame. Then Robert said something that made everyone turn around to look at Margaret. Many of you may not know this, but Mrs. Chen is a 5th-degree black belt in karate. She was a 3-time national champion and trained Olympic-level athletes for over 30 years. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People stared at Margaret, this small, quiet woman in the back row trying to reconcile what they were hearing with what they saw. She had the ability to defend herself at any time, Robert continued. She could have responded to months of harassment with force, but she chose not to. She chose dignity and restraint. That's real strength, and frankly, it's more than Diane deserved. The vote was held that night. Diane Patterson was removed as HOA president by a count of 92-3. The 3 votes in her favor came from her closest friends, and even they looked uncertain. Diane stood up, grabbed her things, and walked out without a word. The room was completely silent as she left. Nobody gloated. Nobody cheered. It just felt sad, watching someone who'd held so much power lose it all because she'd never learned that power should be used to help people, not hurt them. Within 2 months, Diane had sold her house and moved away. The new family that moved in was friendly and quiet. They planted flowers and waved to their neighbors. Robert became the new HOA president. His first act was to reform the entire violation system. Fines were reduced to reasonable amounts and could only be issued for serious problems, not petty things like grass being slightly too tall or welcome mats being the wrong color. He established a committee to review any complaints before violations were issued, making sure no single person could target residents anymore. The board approached Margaret about joining them, but she politely declined. "I'm not really a committee person," she said with a smile. "But thank you for asking." Instead, she offered something different: free self-defense classes for anyone in the community who wanted to learn, not just physical techniques but confidence, awareness, how to carry yourself so you're not seen as an easy target. The first class, Margaret expected maybe 10 people. 35 showed up. They met twice a week in the community center. Margaret taught everyone from teenagers to seniors in their 70s. She showed them basic strikes and blocks, but more importantly, she taught them about mental strength, about staying calm under pressure, about knowing your worth and not letting anyone make you feel small. The best fight is the one you never have, she'd tell her students. But if you have to fight, you fight from a place of strength, not fear. Bill became one of her most dedicated students. At 68, he'd never done martial arts before, but he loved it. "I spent 8 years being scared of Diane," he told Margaret. "Never again. I'm done being scared." The classes changed the whole neighborhood. People walked taller. They looked each other in the eye. They started having block parties and potluck dinners. The community garden project that had been proposed years ago but shut down by Diane finally happened, with Margaret helping plan which vegetables to plant. One Saturday afternoon, almost a year after Margaret had moved to Willow Creek, the neighborhood threw a community appreciation day. There were games for kids, food trucks, a small band playing music. Margaret's daughter brought the grandchildren, and they ran around with the other neighborhood kids, happy and carefree. Robert stood up to give a short speech, thanking everyone who'd helped make Willow Creek a better place. Then he looked at Margaret. "I want to especially thank Margaret Chen," he said. "She showed us that real strength isn't about power over others. It's about maintaining your peace no matter what anyone else does." She could have responded to harassment with violence. Instead, she responded with patience. And when the time came, she didn't seek revenge. She just offered to teach us all how to be stronger. The crowd applauded. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. Later, someone asked her if she'd ever been tempted to reveal her martial arts background earlier, maybe to intimidate Diane into backing off. Margaret thought about it for a moment. "No," she said finally. "That would have made me just like her. Using fear to control people. The point of all my training wasn't to make others afraid of me. It was to make sure I never had to be afraid of anyone else." She looked around at the party, at neighbors who'd become friends, at a community that had found its voice again. "Besides," she added with a small smile, What we built here is better than anything I could have accomplished by fighting. We built trust. We built friendship. You can't do that with your fists. Kevin ran up then, pulling on her sleeve. Grandma, come play. We're having a water balloon fight. Margaret laughed and let her grandson drag her toward the chaos of happy children and water balloons. As she went, she caught Robert's eye and he nodded in respect. She'd come to Willow Creek looking for peace after losing her husband. She'd found harassment instead, months of it, from someone who mistook kindness for weakness. But in the end, she'd found something even better than peace. She'd found a community that learned to stand up for itself. She'd found neighbors who became friends. She'd found a home, and she'd done it all without throwing a single punch. That, Margaret thought as a water balloon exploded on her shoulder and Kevin shrieked with laughter, was the real victory.